A dream and a door slammed shut. On a crisp autumn morning, the city of Savannah, Georgia, was alive with the hum of bustling streets and golden sunlight filtering through the leaves. Jackson Reed, a 42-year-old self-made entrepreneur, pulled his metallic blue Tesla into the lot of Elite Motor Gallery. This wasn't just a casual outing. It was the realization of a long-held dream, purchasing the luxury car he'd worked years to afford. Jackson stepped out of the car, his polished leather shoes clicking on the pavement. Dressed in a tailored gray suit with a subtle pinstripe pattern and a cobalt tie that matched his Tesla, he exuded confidence and pride. His success story was one of grit and determination. Growing up in a low-income neighborhood, Jackson had clawed his way up from nothing. After years of struggle, he had built a thriving tech consultancy firm with branches across the Southeast. As he adjusted his gold watch and smoothed his suit, he turned his gaze to the vehicle that had captured his heart, a pearl-white Aston Martin DB11. It was sleek, elegant, and powerful, a mirror of everything Jackson had become. His heart raced with excitement as he walked towards the glass doors of the dealership. Inside, the showroom was a symphony of luxury. High-end vehicles gleamed under recessed lighting, their polished surfaces reflecting the opulence of the marble floors. The scent of new leather and fresh wax filled the air. Jackson took a deep breath, allowing the moment to sink in. Behind the front desk stood a woman in her late 40s with a sharp bob haircut and a tailored black blazer. Her name tag read Miriam, manager. Her smile was tight and practiced as Jackson approached, but it quickly faltered when her eyes swept over him. There was a fleeting moment of hesitation, barely perceptible, but enough for Jackson to notice. "Good morning," Jackson said, his voice warm and steady. "I'm interested in the Aston Martin DB11. Could you assist me with that?" Miriam's smile returned, but it didn't reach her eyes. "That model starts at $220,000, she replied, her tone overly sweet, almost condescending. "Are you sure you're looking at the right car?" Jackson paused, taken aback. "Yes," he said evenly. "I've done my research, and I'd like to explore financing options." Miriam glanced down at a folder on the desk, avoiding his gaze. "We usually require proof of income and a credit check before discussing financing on high-end models like this," she said, her tone brisk. "It's standard procedure." Jackson frowned. He had anticipated paperwork, of course, but her delivery felt less like standard procedure and more like a deliberate hurdle. Still, he remained composed. "That's not a problem. I have my documents right here," he said, reaching into his briefcase to produce neatly organized files. Miriam hesitated before taking the folder, her fingers brushing the edge as though reluctant to touch it. She opened it and scanned the contents briefly, her expression unreadable. "I'll need to verify these," she said, her voice clipped. "Wait here." As Miriam disappeared into an office, Jackson stood in the center of the showroom, his gaze wandering back to the Aston Martin. This was supposed to be a celebratory moment, a milestone in his journey. But now, unease crept into his chest. A young salesman approached him, his expression friendly but cautious. "Hi there," the man said, extending a hand. His name tag read Elliot. "Can I help you with anything while you wait?" "I appreciate it," Jackson replied, shaking his hand. "I'm just waiting for Miriam to verify my documents." Elliot glanced towards the office where Miriam had gone. "She's thorough," he said diplomatically, then gestured towards the Aston Martin. "Beautiful choice, by the way. That's one of our finest models. It handles like a dream." Jackson smiled. "That's exactly why I'm here. It's been on my radar for years." Before their conversation could continue, Miriam returned, her expression tight. She handed Jackson's folder back to him, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice devoid of warmth, "but I don't think we can move forward with this. Perhaps a different dealership might be a better fit for you." Jackson blinked, stunned. "Excuse me." Miriam folded her arms, her gaze hardening. We have limited stock on high-demand models like this. We'd prefer to reserve them for serious buyers." Anger flared in Jackson's chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I am a serious buyer. I came prepared with all the necessary documents. If there's an issue, I'd like to understand it." "It's not personal," Miriam said with a shrug. "We just have to prioritize." Jackson stared at her, the weight of her words settling heavily. He knew what was happening. He'd seen it before, felt it before. This wasn't about finances or availability. This was about her assumptions. Assumptions based on the color of his skin. Elliot shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Jackson and Miriam. "If I may," he interjected, his voice tentative, "we don't usually turn customers away without exploring options." Miriam shot him a withering look. "Stay out of this, Elliot. I'm handling it." Jackson took a deep breath, his composure hard-won. "I didn't come here to argue," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I came here to make a purchase. If you refuse to assist me, I'll take my business and my story elsewhere." Miriam smirked, a glint of defiance in her eyes. "Do what you have to do." Jackson turned and walked out of the dealership, his heart heavy, but his resolve unshaken. He wasn't just leaving behind a car. He was walking away from yet another reminder that even in 2024, success couldn't shield him from prejudice. But as he stepped into his Tesla and closed the door, a plan began to form in his mind. He wasn't going to let this slide. This wasn't just about him. It was about confronting the bias that lurked in places that prided themselves on luxury and exclusivity. What happened next, Jackson knew, would be far bigger than a car purchase. It would be a stand against the very assumptions that tried to hold him back. Breaking the silence, Jackson sat behind the wheel of his Tesla, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The Aston Martin DB11 was no longer the center of his thoughts. It had been replaced by a burning sense of injustice. The cold indifference in Miriam's voice, the subtle but undeniable barriers she put up, and the way she dismissed his presence, all of it festered in his mind. The drive home was quiet, save for the faint hum of his electric car. As he parked in the driveway of his modern, two-story home overlooking a quiet Savannah street, Jackson's mind was already made up. He wasn't going to let this incident fade into another frustrating memory. He had a platform, resources, and a voice. It was time to use them. That evening, Jackson sat at his desk, staring at his laptop. He began by writing down everything that had happened at Elite Motor Gallery, every word, every glance, and every pause that carried unspoken meaning. He wanted to ensure he captured every detail with precision, knowing that clarity would be crucial for what he planned next. As he typed, he remembered the feeling of standing in the dealership, his confidence chipped away by Miriam's dismissiveness. He thought of others who might have experienced the same treatment, but hadn't had the means or resolve to fight back. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had been silently pushed aside by subtle acts of prejudice. When he finished drafting his account, he uploaded a post to his social media platforms. Accompanying the detailed description of his experience was a simple but powerful statement. "Success doesn't exempt us from bias, but silence perpetuates it. Today, I was reminded that even in spaces of luxury, judgment can overshadow merit. It's time to shine a light on these hidden barriers and demand better, not just for me, but for everyone who's been overlooked." #Stand for dignity, #break the bias. Jackson hesitated for a moment before pressing post. He wasn't naive. He knew the potential backlash, but he also knew the power of his network. Over the years, he'd built a strong following of professionals, activists, and leaders who shared his values. If anyone could amplify his voice, it was them. The response was immediate. Within hours, Jackson's post had gone viral. Comments poured in from people who shared similar experiences, offering support and encouragement. Some recounted their own stories of subtle discrimination, while others expressed outrage at the treatment Jackson had endured. One comment stood out among the rest. "As a former employee of Elite Motor Gallery, I can confirm this isn't an isolated incident. Their unspoken policies target anyone they deem unsuitable. Keep speaking out, Jackson. This needs to change." Jackson's heart raced as he read the comment. It was one thing to suspect a pattern, but another to have it confirmed by an insider. He immediately reached out to the commenter via private message, thanking them for their bravery and asking if they'd be willing to share more. To his surprise, the person, whose name was Maya, responded within minutes. They agreed to meet the next day at a local coffee shop. The next morning, Jackson arrived early at the cafe, his mind buzzing with anticipation. Maya was a petite woman in her late 20s with a professional demeanor and a no-nonsense attitude. She greeted Jackson warmly, but got straight to the point as they sat down. "I worked at Elite for 3 years, Maya began, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. "When I started, I thought it was a dream job. But it didn't take long to notice certain things." "What kind of things?" Jackson asked, leaning forward. Maya sighed. "It's subtle. They don't outright say, 'We don't want certain people here.' But the culture is clear. If someone doesn't fit the image they want to project, they find ways to discourage them, delaying processes, steering them toward lower-end models, or just outright dismissing them. Miriam is one of the worst. She's been there forever and thinks she owns the place." Jackson nodded, his jaw tightening. "Did you ever speak up about it?" "I tried," Maya said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "But the higher-ups brushed it off. They said I was overreacting or misinterpreting things. Eventually, I left. I couldn't be part of a place that treated people like that." Jackson's mind raced as he processed Maya's words. "Would you be willing to share your story publicly?" he asked. "I think it could make a huge difference." Maya hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I don't want to face backlash or lose opportunities because I spoke out." Jackson placed a reassuring hand on the table. "I understand. But your voice could inspire others to come forward, and together we can make it impossible for them to ignore this." Maya took a deep breath, then nodded. "I'll do it. But only if we do it the right way, professionally, with facts and evidence." Over the next few days, Jackson and Maya worked together to compile a comprehensive account of the practices at Elite Motor Gallery. They gathered testimonials from other former employees, each story painting a clearer picture of the dealership's discriminatory culture. Jackson also reached out to local journalists, providing them with the information and inviting them to investigate further. Meanwhile, the online conversation continued to grow. Influential voices in business and social justice began sharing Jackson's post, adding their own commentary and calling for accountability. The hashtag #BreakTheBias trended nationally, sparking a broader discussion about subtle discrimination in luxury spaces. By the end of the week, the local news station ran a feature story on Jackson's experience, complete with interviews from Maya and other former employees. The dealership's practices were laid bare for all to see. Back at Elite Motor Gallery, the fallout was swift and severe. Customers began canceling appointments, and the showroom, once bustling with activity, grew eerily quiet. Miriam, still clinging to her position of authority, tried to downplay the accusations in a hastily arranged press conference, but her defensive statements only fueled the public's anger. The dealership's corporate office finally stepped in, announcing an internal investigation and placing Miriam on indefinite leave. They also issued a statement promising to overhaul their policies and provide diversity training for all staff. Jackson watched the developments unfold with a mix of satisfaction and resolve. This was just the beginning. While he was glad to see progress, he knew that real change would require sustained effort. As he sat in his living room, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from Maya. "Thank you, Jackson, for believing in me and for fighting for all of us." Jackson smiled, his heart swelling with pride. He hadn't set out to become a crusader for justice, but the events of the past week had shown him the power of standing up and speaking out. And as he looked out the window at the vibrant Savannah skyline, he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't done yet. Turning the tide. The sun was just beginning to set over Savannah, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink as Jackson sat at his dining table with a growing pile of documents, emails, and notes in front of him. His mission had taken on a life of its own, far beyond the boundaries of Elite Motor Gallery. What had started as one man's confrontation with bias had evolved into a movement, and Jackson was at its helm. Across the table sat Maya, the former Elite Motor Gallery employee who had become a pivotal ally. She was sifting through a series of printed emails from ex-employees who had come forward anonymously to share their stories. Beside her, Jackson's assistant, Dina, a sharp-witted communications expert, was typing furiously on her laptop, coordinating interviews and managing the flow of information. Jackson leaned back, rubbing his temples. "We've got a mountain of evidence here," he said, "but we need to present it in a way that people can't ignore. Facts are powerful, but we need to tell the human stories behind them." Maya nodded. "It's not just about showing what happened. It's about making people feel the impact of it. We need to connect with their hearts." Dina paused her typing and looked up. "We also need to be strategic," she said. "This isn't just about one dealership. It's about changing the way businesses operate and how they treat people. If we focus too much on just Elite, the bigger message might get lost." Jackson exhaled slowly, his mind racing. "You're right. We need to take this beyond Savannah, beyond this one incident." The next day, Jackson and his team unveiled the next phase of their campaign. The Invisible Barriers Initiative, a platform designed to spotlight instances of bias and discrimination in high-end spaces across industries. The initiative included a website where people could share their stories, access resources for taking action, and learn about businesses committed to inclusivity. The website launch was accompanied by a powerful video, narrated by Jackson, featuring testimonials from individuals who had experienced subtle and overt bias. Maya appeared in the video, her voice steady and clear as she recounted her time at Elite Motor Gallery. The stories were raw and emotional, driving home the reality of the issue in a way that facts and statistics couldn't. Within hours, the video had amassed thousands of views, and the initiative began trending on social media. Influencers, activists, and everyday people joined the conversation, using the hashtag Invisible Barriers to share their own experiences. The ripple effect was immediate, with businesses across the country being called out for their practices or praised for their inclusivity. Meanwhile, the pressure on Elite Motor Gallery continued to mount. The dealership had gone from a symbol of luxury to a lightning rod for controversy. News outlets picked up the story, and customers began demanding transparency. The corporate office, desperate to salvage their reputation, announced a town hall meeting, inviting the public to voice their concerns and discuss the steps they planned to take. Jackson received an email from the corporate office, extending a personal invitation to attend the town hall. The tone was formal, almost pleading, as they emphasized their desire to listen and learn. Jackson forwarded the email to Maya and Dina, his lips curling into a wry smile. "They want to listen and learn," he said, the words dripping with skepticism. "Let's make sure they do." The town hall was held in a grand ballroom at a local hotel, its chandeliers casting a soft glow over the packed audience. Jackson arrived with Maya and Dina by his side, their presence drawing murmurs from the crowd. Journalists with cameras and notepads hovered near the entrance, eager to capture every moment. At the front of the room sat a panel of Elite Motor Gallery executives, including Douglas Harper, the general manager who had taken over after Miriam's suspension. He looked visibly uneasy as the audience settled in. The meeting began with Douglas delivering a carefully worded apology. "We acknowledge that mistakes were made," he said, his voice steady but devoid of genuine emotion, "and we are committed to making changes to ensure that every customer is treated with respect and fairness." The word hung in the air, met with a tepid response from the audience. Jackson leaned over to Maya and whispered, "Let's see if they can back up those words with action." When it was time for public comments, Jackson was one of the first to approach the microphone. His presence commanded the room, and the murmur of voices died down as he began to speak. "My name is Jackson Reed," he said, his voice resonating with conviction. "A week ago, I walked into Elite Motor Gallery, excited to purchase a car that represented years of hard work and success. Instead, I was met with dismissal and disrespect. What I experienced wasn't just poor customer service. It was a reflection of deeply ingrained biases that have no place in today's society." The audience erupted into applause, and Jackson waited for the noise to die down before continuing. "But this isn't just about me. It's about the countless others who have been turned away, undervalued, or judged because of who they are or how they look. It's about a culture that prioritizes image over integrity." He turned to the panel, his gaze piercing. "You say you're committed to change, but words without action are meaningless. So tell us, what concrete steps are you taking to ensure this doesn't happen again?" Douglas shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his collar visibly damp with sweat. "We're implementing mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff," he said. "We're also revising our policies to ensure that every customer receives equal treatment, regardless of background." Jackson nodded, his expression neutral. "And how will you measure the effectiveness of these changes? How will you hold yourselves accountable?" Douglas hesitated, fumbling for an answer. Before he could respond, another voice cut through the silence. "I can help with that." All eyes turned to the back of the room, where a tall woman with striking silver hair and a commanding presence stood. She introduced herself as Dr. Evelyn Grant, a prominent diversity consultant who had worked with Fortune 500 companies to transform their corporate cultures. "I've been following this situation closely," Dr. Grant said, walking toward the front of the room. "And I believe this is an opportunity for real, systemic change. But it requires more than promises. It requires expertise, transparency, and accountability." The crowd erupted into cheers, and Jackson couldn't help but smile. This was the turning point he had hoped for. In the weeks that followed, the Lit Motor Gallery partnered with Dr. Grant to overhaul their operations. Miriam was terminated, and new leadership was brought in to steer the dealership toward a more inclusive future. The changes weren't immediate, but they were tangible, a testament to the power of collective action. Jackson's initiative, meanwhile, continued to grow. The Invisible Barriers Initiative gained national attention, sparking conversations in boardrooms, classrooms, and living rooms across the country. Jackson became a sought-after speaker, sharing his story and advocating for a world where no one would have to fight for the dignity they deserved. And while the Aston Martin DB11 still eluded him, Jackson had found something far more valuable, a purpose that extended beyond his own success, toward a vision of equality and justice for all. A storm of resistance, the buzz surrounding the Invisible Barriers Initiative continued to grow, and Jackson found himself busier than ever. His phone rang incessantly with calls from journalists, activists, and even business leaders seeking advice on how to address discrimination within their organizations. Yet, amidst the wave of support, there was also resistance. Not everyone appreciated Jackson's bold stance. Some accused him of overreacting, claiming his experience at Elite Motor Gallery was an isolated incident. Others argued that his campaign unfairly targeted businesses, painting them as villains without sufficient evidence. Social media, which had initially amplified Jackson's message, now became a battleground. One particularly scathing article from a local business columnist questioned Jackson's motives, suggesting he was leveraging the situation for personal gain. The piece spread quickly, and while many dismissed it as sensationalist, the backlash was enough to make Jackson pause. Sitting in his home office late one evening, Jackson scrolled through comments on the article, a mix of support and vitriol. His assistant, Dina, appeared in the doorway, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "You've been at it for hours," she said, setting a mug on his desk. "You need to take a break." Jackson sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's hard to ignore the noise. I knew there'd be pushback, but some of this feels personal." Dina pulled up a chair and sat across from him. That's because it is personal to them. You're challenging the status quo, and people don't like being forced to confront uncomfortable truths. But you're not doing this alone. Look at everything we've accomplished so far. Jackson smiled faintly. You're right. It's just exhausting. Dina leaned forward, her expression earnest. If it wasn't hard, it wouldn't be worth doing. Remember why you started this. Her words hung in the air, a gentle reminder of the purpose that had driven Jackson from the beginning. He nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. The next day, Jackson decided to address the resistance head-on. He scheduled a live-streamed queue and a session, inviting people to ask him anything about his campaign, the initiative, and his experiences. It was a bold move, but Jackson believed in transparency. The session was held in a small studio, with a simple backdrop featuring the Invisible Barriers Initiative logo. Jackson sat in a leather chair, flanked by Maya and Dina, who would help moderate the questions. The live stream began with Jackson delivering a heartfelt opening statement. "Good evening, everyone," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I started the Invisible Barriers Initiative because of a personal experience that made me realize just how pervasive bias can be, even in spaces where we least expect it. But this isn't just about me. It's about creating a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, no matter where they come from or what they look like." Questions poured in rapidly, some supportive, others skeptical. One viewer asked, "Do you really think one person's bad experience is enough to justify calling out an entire industry?" Jackson leaned forward, his expression serious. "It's not just one experience. Since launching this initiative, we've collected hundreds of stories from people who faced similar treatment in various industries. This is a systemic issue, not an isolated one. My experience was just the spark. It's the collected voices that are fueling this movement." Another question read, "Aren't you afraid of hurting businesses that don't deserve it?" Jackson nodded thoughtfully. "That's a valid concern. Our goal isn't to hurt businesses. It's to hold them accountable and help them grow. We're not against businesses. We're against practices that exclude and discriminate. Change doesn't happen by staying silent." Maya chimed in, sharing her own experience as a former employee at Elite Motor Gallery. Her voice was steady, but her words carried the weight of someone who had lived through the very issues they were discussing. If businesses truly care about their reputation and their customers, they'll see this as an opportunity, not an attack. By the end of the live stream, Jackson and his team had fielded dozens of questions. The event was a resounding success, with viewers praising Jackson's honesty and commitment to addressing even the toughest criticisms. But the resistance wasn't just online. It soon became clear that some individuals were determined to discredit Jackson and his initiative. An anonymous email leaked to a local news station accused him of fabricating his experience at Elite Motor Gallery. The email claimed to be from a current employee, though no evidence was provided to support the accusations. When Jackson saw the story on the evening news, his stomach dropped. While the station had presented the email as unverified, the damage was already done. Social media buzzed with speculation, and Jackson found himself once again at the center of a storm. Dina was the first to call him after the story aired. "We need to get ahead of this," she said, her tone urgent. "If we let it fester, it'll undermine everything we've built." Jackson agreed. He contacted a trusted journalist who had been following the campaign closely, offering to provide evidence that corroborated his story. Within hours, the journalist published a detailed piece debunking the anonymous email, complete with statements from Maya and other former employees of Elite Motor Gallery. The article restored some of the public's trust, but Jackson knew the battle was far from over. The backlash was a reminder that challenging the status quo wasn't just difficult, it was dangerous. But instead of discouraging him, it strengthened his resolve. A week later, Jackson received a surprising email. It was from a senior executive at a major luxury brand. inviting him to speak at an upcoming industry conference on the topic of inclusivity in business. Jackson read the email twice, unsure if it was genuine. The executive, whose name was Laura Simmons, had attached a personal note. "Mr. Reed, I followed your journey with great interest. I believe the issues you've highlighted are ones our industry must address, and your insights would be invaluable. If you're willing, I'd love to have you as a keynote speaker at our conference next month." Jackson forwarded the email to Dina and Maya, his excitement tempered by caution. "What do you think?" he asked during their next meeting. Dina smiled. "I think this is exactly the kind of opportunity we've been working toward. You'd be addressing the people who have the power to make real change." Maya nodded. If they're serious about inclusivity, this could be a turning point, not just for them, but for the industry as a whole. Jackson agreed. He replied to Laura Simmons, accepting the invitation and beginning preparations for what would be one of the most important speeches of his life. As he stood in front of a mirror the night before the conference, rehearsing his speech, Jackson couldn't help but reflect on how far he'd come. The road had been fraught with challenges, but each hurdle had reinforced his belief in the importance of his mission. Tomorrow, he would stand before an audience of industry leaders and share his vision for a world where invisible barriers were dismantled and every individual had the opportunity to thrive. It was a daunting task, but one he was ready to face head-on. The keynote that shook the industry. The auditorium buzzed with the low hum of anticipation as hundreds of industry leaders, business executives, and media representatives filed into their seats. The conference, titled Luxury Beyond Barriers, A New Era of Inclusivity, was a prestigious gathering of the who's who in the luxury goods and services world. Jackson Reed, once a single voice in a storm of injustice, was now the keynote speaker, a role he hadn't anticipated but fully embraced. The stage was minimalist, with a single podium framed by a massive screen displaying the Invisible Barriers Initiative logo. Jackson stood backstage, adjusting the lapels of his tailored navy suit. Maya and Dina flanked him, their supportive smiles steadying his nerves. "You've got this," Dina said, handing him a bottle of water. "Remember, this isn't just about the people in this room. It's about everyone who's watching, listening, and hoping for change." Maya nodded. "Speak your truth. They won't be able to ignore it." Jackson took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. He had spent weeks preparing for this speech, but he knew that the true power of his words would come from speaking from the heart. As Jackson stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. The spotlight illuminated his face, and he could see rows of attentive faces staring back at him. Some looked curious, others skeptical. He knew he was about to challenge deeply ingrained norms, and not everyone would welcome his message. "Good afternoon," Jackson began, his voice steady but powerful. "When I was first invited to speak here, I was honored, but I was also hesitant. Honored because I believe in the potential of this industry to lead the way in creating a more inclusive world. Hesitant because I knew the conversation we need to have wouldn't be easy." He paused, scanning the audience. But change never is. Jackson shared his story, recounting his experience at Elite Motor Gallery with honesty and vulnerability. He painted a vivid picture of the subtle dismissiveness, the quiet biases, and the way they had chipped away at what should have been a celebratory moment. The room was utterly silent as he spoke, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "But my story," he continued, "is just one of many. Since launching the Invisible Barriers Initiative, I've heard from hundreds of people, customers, employees, even former executives, who have faced the same invisible walls I did. And those walls don't just hurt individuals. They hurt businesses, communities, and the progress we all claim to strive for." Jackson clicked a remote, and the screen behind him displayed a series of statistics. Lost revenue from underserved markets, declining customer loyalty due to perceived bias, and the growing demand for inclusivity from younger generations. "This isn't just a moral issue," Jackson said, his voice firm. "It's a business issue. The future of luxury isn't about exclusivity, it's about inclusivity. It's about recognizing that diversity isn't a threat to your brand. It's an opportunity to grow, innovate, and lead. As he spoke, Jackson transitioned from recounting problems to proposing solutions. He outlined practical steps for businesses to dismantle invisible barriers. From implementing robust training programs to diversifying leadership teams, to actively seeking feedback from underrepresented groups. He emphasized the importance of accountability. It's not enough to make promises, he said. You have to measure progress, listen to criticism, and adapt. Transparency isn't a weakness, it's a strength. Jackson ended his speech with a challenge. To everyone in this room, I ask you, what kind of legacy do you want to leave? One where luxury is defined by exclusion, or one where it becomes a symbol of shared excellence? The choice is yours. But know this, the world is watching. The room erupted into applause. Some stood, clapping enthusiastically, while others remained seated, their expressions contemplative. Jackson stepped back from the podium, his heart pounding. He had delivered his message. Now, it was up to them to act. After the keynote, the conference hall transformed into a networking space. Attendees approached Jackson in waves, some offering praise, others asking questions or sharing their own stories. Maya and Dina stayed close, fielding inquiries and handing out information about the initiative. One of the first to approach was Laura Simmons, the executive who had invited Jackson to speak. "You were incredible," she said, shaking his hand. "You didn't just deliver a speech, you lit a fire. I've already spoken with several colleagues who want to partner with your initiative." Jackson smiled. "That's what I hoped for. This isn't about pointing fingers. It's about finding solutions together." As the evening wore on, Jackson found himself in conversation with a range of individuals. A CEO eager to revamp their company's hiring practices, a young entrepreneur inspired to build inclusivity into their startup from the ground up, and even a journalist who had initially been critical of Jackson's approach, but now admitted they were reconsidering their stance. But not everyone was supportive. A group of older executives stood off to the side, their hushed conversation punctuated by disapproving glances in Jackson's direction. One of them, a gruff man named Richard Carrington, eventually approached. "I respect what you're trying to do," Carrington said, his tone curt. "But you have to understand, luxury is built on exclusivity. You can't just change that overnight." Jackson met his gaze, unwavering. "Exclusivity doesn't have to mean exclusion," he said. "Luxury can be about quality, craftsmanship, and experience without alienating people based on outdated notions of who belongs." Carrington frowned but said nothing more, retreating to his group. Jackson turned back to Maya, who gave him a reassuring nod. "You can't win them all," she whispered, "but you made him think." By the time the event ended, Jackson was exhausted but exhilarated. The conference had been a turning point, not just for the initiative, but for him personally. He had stepped into the lion's den and emerged with new allies, fresh momentum, and a renewed sense of purpose. As he left the auditorium, his phone buzzed with a message from a young woman who had been in the audience. "Thank you for speaking today. I've always dreamed of working in luxury fashion, but I was afraid I wouldn't fit in. Your words gave me hope. Please don't stop fighting." Jackson smiled, his resolve strengthened. The battle wasn't over, but the tide was turning, and for the first time, he felt that the walls of exclusion he had faced were beginning to crumble, not just for him, but for everyone. A legacy of change. The following months were a whirlwind of activity for Jackson Reed and the Invisible Barriers Initiative. The keynote speech at the Luxury Industry Conference had cemented Jackson's position as a leading voice for inclusivity in high-end spaces. Invitations to speak, consult, and collaborate poured in, and Jackson found himself traveling across the country, meeting with CEOs, activists, and community leaders. Yet, amidst the success, Jackson never lost sight of the moment that started it all. His encounter at Elite Motor Gallery. That single instance of discrimination had ignited a movement, but it also served as a reminder of how much work remained. One chilly morning, Jackson stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie. He was preparing for an important meeting with Elite Motor Gallery's new leadership team. The dealership had undergone significant changes since the public outcry, including the firing of Miriam and the hiring of a new general manager, Susan Carter, who had reached out to Jackson personally. "This isn't just a PR stunt," Susan had assured him during their initial conversation. "We're serious about making things right, and we want your guidance to help us rebuild." Jackson was skeptical but agreed to meet. He believed in the possibility of redemption, but only if it was accompanied by real accountability and action. As Jackson entered the dealership's familiar glass doors, he was struck by how different the atmosphere felt. The showroom was still pristine, the cars gleaming under soft lights, but there was a noticeable warmth in the interactions between staff and customers. It was subtle, but it felt genuine. Susan Carter greeted Jackson with a firm handshake and a welcoming smile. She was a tall, no-nonsense woman with a reputation for turning struggling businesses around. "Mr. Reed," she said, "thank you for coming. We've made some big changes, and I'd like to show you what we've done." Susan led Jackson on a tour of the dealership, pointing out the changes they'd implemented. Staff training rooms were now equipped with diversity and inclusion modules, and the dealership had partnered with local organizations to recruit a more diverse workforce. A bulletin board in the employee lounge showcased stories of exceptional customer service, highlighting moments where staff had gone above and beyond to make every customer feel valued. "Change isn't easy," Susan admitted as they walked. "We lost some employees who didn't agree with our new direction, and there were some tough conversations with corporate, but we're committed to doing better." Jackson nodded, impressed but cautious. "These are great steps," he said, "but real change takes time. It's about consistency, not just initial effort." Susan smiled. "That's why we want you to hold us accountable. We're inviting you to be a part of our advisory board, to help us stay on track and ensure we're living up to our commitments." The offer caught Jackson off guard. He hadn't expected such a direct request, but as he considered it, he realized it was an opportunity to create lasting impact from the inside. As news of Jackson's partnership with Elite Motor Gallery spread, it sparked both praise and criticism. Supporters lauded his ability to turn a negative experience into a catalyst for change, while skeptics questioned whether the dealership's efforts were genuine or merely performative. Jackson addressed the criticism head-on in a public statement. "Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without risk," he said. "By working with Elite Motor Gallery, I'm not endorsing their past behavior. I'm holding them to a higher standard for the future. If we want progress, we have to be willing to engage, even when it's uncomfortable." The impact of Jackson's work soon began to ripple beyond Elite Motor Gallery. Other businesses in the luxury sector reached out to him, seeking guidance on how to create more inclusive environments. The Invisible Barriers Initiative grew into a robust organization with a team of dedicated professionals who provided training, consultation, and resources for companies eager to evolve. One of the initiative's most ambitious projects was the launch of the Barriers Report, an annual publication that evaluated industries on their inclusivity practices. The report highlighted both the successes and shortcomings of major brands, encouraging transparency and fostering competition to improve. The first Barriers Report made waves across the business world. Companies that scored poorly faced public scrutiny, while those that excelled were celebrated as leaders in inclusivity. It was a bold move, but Jackson believed in the power of accountability. As the initiative flourished, Jackson took a step back to reflect on his journey. One evening, he sat on the balcony of his Savannah home, the city lights twinkling in the distance. Maya and Dina joined him, carrying glasses of wine. "You've built something incredible," Maya said, raising her glass. "And it all started with one moment, one car, one dealership." Jackson chuckled, shaking his head. "It's funny, isn't it? I walked into that place just wanting to buy a car. I never imagined it would lead to this." Dina leaned back in her chair, her gaze thoughtful. "That's the thing about moments like that. They seem small at first, but they have the power to change everything." Jackson raised his glass, a smile spreading across his face. "To change," he said, "the kind that lasts." They clinked their glasses, the sound a quiet but powerful acknowledgement of everything they had accomplished, and everything that was still to come. The next morning, Jackson received an email from a young woman named Alicia. She was a recent college graduate who had seen his keynote speech and was inspired to pursue a career in the luxury automotive industry. "I just wanted to thank you," Alicia wrote, "for showing me that I belong in spaces where people like me are often overlooked. Because of you, I'm not afraid to dream big." Jackson's chest swelled with pride as he read her words. They were a reminder of why he had started this journey and why he would continue, no matter how challenging the road ahead. He typed a reply, his fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. "Dear Alicia, thank you for your kind words. You do belong, and your dreams are valid. Keep pushing forward, and never let anyone make you feel like you don't deserve a seat at the table. If you ever need guidance or support, know that you're not alone. Best, Jackson Reed." As he hit send, Jackson felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The invisible barriers he had once faced were beginning to crumble, one story, one action, and one person at a time. And the best part, this was only the beginning.